Hello, welcome back. So we're going to talk image quality. There's probably 2 or 3 aspects that are really important, and we're going to do some comparison. Little point and shoots against the bigger APS-C, bigger lenses, and there's sometimes some optical illusions that go on with picture sharpness, color contrast that we need to address. So before that, I'm going to post a photo and have you look at it. It's 2 blocks. What comes to mind? Which one is actually the brightest, which one's darker? And kind of go ahead and give a look at that. And as you probably guess, you've probably seen this many, many times before, but they're actually the same brightness. If you look at the squares in the background and the gradations of the colors, the brightness and all that, there's a little bit of an optical illusion going on there. And our minds kind of trick ourselves into thinking that one thing is brighter than the other. So we can use some of this to our advantage, because when a viewer looks at something in context with what we're putting out, we can mess with contrast, bokeh, background blur, and all that. So let's get into this. We have some bird photographs that we performed, I think, probably 2 weeks ago in backyard birding, and let's go through that piece and start comparing, the smaller lenses to the larger lenses. Right up front, I'm going to tell you that this camera here probably has a sharper lens than the 150-600. In fact, looking at the sharpness and the resolution of this lens, I would say it's sharper than my Sigma 300-800, that big Sigma monster lens, when shot out at full length, full zoom, and maximum aperture. This actually is sharper, but you would not know that unless you really started looking at how we perceive the image. So yeah, let's dig into this and we'll do a breakdown of how to improve the image process as we move forward. Before we get started, you can check out the video I posted a couple weeks ago on lens sharpness and resolution between the little point and shoots and the bigger lenses. We take a couple different static subjects and do a comparison of the zoom, some of the resolution, what it looks like. And that will give you a good indication for the capabilities of these cameras as well. If you want to check that out after this video, that would be great. Anyway, let's jump into the photo comparison. We have a couple different sets of photographs, and let's keep in mind the little brain teaser at the beginning of this, the 2 blocks with the different tones, or they look like they had different brightnesses, because it can be the same thing with focus and sharpness and background blur. So we have the M200 shot with the 150-600, which in this image you'll see is actually it looks really sharp. The background is just totally blown out. You can't give any context. And so that's kind of like the block that the medium tone block that's sitting in the white, total pitch white background. If we look at it this way, it really jumps out at you. The bird has that pop. But if we go to the next image, and this image was actually shot probably 17 years ago with a Sigma 50-500. So the depth of field, actually, that sensor, it's a 1.5 crop, so it has a little bit more punch, but the area that we've actually photographed this in has sticks and a bunch of background noise. So if you were to ask the common person, not anybody watching this, but just which lens do you think is the sharpest? What photo do you think is the sharpest? I'm willing to bet that they're going to say the first one, simply because that's such a radical difference in the background. The compression and everything is totally blown out in the first one. This one, we know that the bird's sitting on a perch. There's some trees, but it really, the photo, if we look in the next photo, we can look at the eyes, and they're both very sharp. They're both very sharp, but in context with the sparrow, there's just nothing to see in the background. And in fact, part of the tail actually melts away. So it's one thing to keep in mind when you're photographing, especially with small sensors and that. And it doesn't really matter. You can have a full-size APS-C or even full frame camera to get your background as clean as possible, if that's what you're going for. If you're going for sharpness, if you want to make that wow factor of a beautiful bird or something, get the distraction, get that distraction, get the background clean. Now with smaller sensor cameras, you got to get the background further away and you have to get closer to the subject. So, you know, in the essence of the next photo, here is the M200 with the sparrow. And again, very much 150 to 600, the background's pretty much thrown out of focus. And if we look at the, I guess the finch here, this was shot with the little SX740, you can still see the background. You can still see that it's an evergreen tree, a pine tree. And if we look at the photos of how sharp they are, they're pretty close to the same sharpness. But again, if we were to ask an untrained eye, they would probably go with the sparrow photograph as well. So looking at this, we know the shortcomings of the small sensor cameras. And in this instance, in a backyard, you're kind of at a premium for background space. But if you get out in the field, you put some seed down, you get that space, you really can't tell a difference. Because if you look at the detail of both birds, it's really, really close. And in fact, I think the little point and shoot was shot at ISO 400, so it's even suffering from ISO damage. But anyway, that does help out in looking at this. So get some background space, get as close as you can, and you can make things pop. Even if the lens is a cheapy lens. So the second thing, lens sharpness versus lens resolution. So it's a little bit confusing. So a sharp lens does not mean that it can necessarily resolve a lot of detail. So if you can have a sharp lens, for instance, this Sigma 600mm f8 lens is actually sharper than this 600mm f6.3 lens, but the resolving power, meaning how many megapixels it can resolve in detail, is somewhat limited, and that is generally the case for these mirror lenses. I would put it at maybe 15 to 20 megapixels max. So if you put a big sensor behind it, it will render the photograph sharp, but not a whole lot of detail. The other thing these mirror lenses have an issue with is contrast and color. They've always been a little bit dull, a little bit flat. So historically speaking, this is an old film day lens, f8, 600mm, very light, but there needs to be some color correction, or there needs to be some things taken into consideration when processing the image. Even with digital, it's much easier. But if you have a smaller lens that is sharp and has resolution but lacks contrast, or if you have a smaller sensor camera that has the ability to resolve more with a smaller lens, you might be better off, and that might be the case here. So let me show you two photographs. The first one is a squirrel photograph shot with the Sony A7R III, 42 megapixels, and a mirror lens, 500mm f8. So this is a 42 megapixel camera, and you can see from the image, ISO 3200, the image is actually sharp. It actually comes off pretty sharp. And then if we look at another image that was performed in our backyard birding video a few weeks back, we have an image of a squirrel that is shot with the Nikon P1000 at about 750, 800 millimeters, and this is 16 megapixels. And different lens, way smaller sensor. But if we look at the detail up close, if you look at the squirrel detail and zoom in, you'll notice that it's sharp, but when you get to the hairs of the squirrel and really zoom in, it kind of falls apart. And there's a few reasons. One's the high ISO, the other is we are doing a crop to it, but it's the resolving power. A lot of it's the resolving power of the lens. So it's good and bad. One is, you know, that if you have such a lens that doesn't have a lot of resolving power, what you want to try to do is get in close, because you don't have a whole lot of crop. You don't have a whole lot of ability to crop in with a lot of detail. So the closer you can get, obviously you get more pixels on it, and you don't have to crop in and zoom in digitally to the image. But it's just something to note that is surprising, that you can have a really great camera and a not so great lens. And that's one of the things with these newer cameras, that when you're going above 30 megapixels with the APS-C sensor, or you're going in the full frame where they're pushing 50 and 60 megapixels, there's not a whole lot of lenses that are going to resolve all that. So you need high quality lenses, which then boost it up. And in some instances, they don't even have native lenses for the camera to take advantage of that sensor. So take that into consideration. It's not all rosy on the full frame front, but knowing that you have a small camera that's really built in well with the lens and the sensor tied in together is, I guess it's a really great thing. You get a really good bang for the buck versus trying to mix and match lenses with DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, because not everything is built specifically for that tolerance. And we'll get into the next one, color and contrast, that has to do with the mirror lenses as well as some of the point and shoots, is, for the most part, smaller lenses. So color and contrast, one of the other things that is kind of misleading, and people really don't think about it much. The color contrast, this first photo of the Blue Jay, this is shot with the Sigma 300 to 800, and it looks sharp. It's shot at f6.3. I had to shoot it down, or actually stop down a little bit, because that lens, believe it or not, it's a very expensive lens, as we've mentioned before, but shot at f5.6. It's been noted as being a little soft at f5.6. So 6.3 it gets sharper. 7.1 f-stop, it is definitely sharp, and f8 is about the sharpest. You're just not gonna, and it is really sharp at that. But noting that this photo, the eye is a little soft in the bird, but with the color, the contrast, if we look at the black and the lighting is really good on that it just pops along with the background. You don't necessarily have to have a super sharp image. Everything doesn't have to be pixel perfect to leave a fairly decent impression. So let's go and look at a few other things. So color and contrast. Now we have two photographs here just taken seconds apart. One, the first photo is of a sparrow with like zero processing, post-processing. It looks flat. It looks a little boring. It's an overcast day. And then the next photo is a post-processed image. This is where we've increased the color and the contrast a little bit. So you'll notice the sparrow, same sparrow, seconds apart. What you'll notice is the blacks really pop on the photo, and it gives a little bit more depth. It gives a little bit more detail, like it's almost sharper. And if you notice the background, there's a lot of things we can do to the images just in color contrast, dodge and burning, to give things a little bit extra pop. Like you wouldn't think, we're gonna compare these side by side, you wouldn't think this is almost the same lens or the same day if you were looking at this. And again, if you asked, question someone that wasn't really in tune, which one of them is sharper or which one looks a little better, I think they're definitely gonna take the bird on the left that's been color corrected and sharpened up, and give it a little bit more punch. The color's a little bit more lively. And you can do that with certain things. You could keep the background a little bit off color, and then you could punch in the colors on the bird just to make it jump out just a little bit more. So again, same camera, same position, everything, just seconds apart. And you can tell, to me, I think the one on the left with the birdseed in his mouth just looks a little punchier. There was really no sharpening done. It looks sharper, but there was no post-processing of sharpening that needed to be done, because it's just plenty sharp enough. It just needs to be, some of the highlights need to be lifted, some of the contrast needs to be put in, and bam, it really works. So color contrast, that is some of the things you need to think about. But when you're actually using your camera, here is another tip, which You have to realize these point and shoots, or any lens, has a certain amount of lens flare and it has a certain amount of contrast. So more so, these little point and shoots are really, they suffer from a lack of contrast. Now, there's a lot of processing going into the lens and the image using the lens in here. They kind of color correct, remove chromatic stuff, purple fringing. There's a lot of things to remove, but that's an average light. So if you point your lens or your camera towards, let's say, incoming light, it's going to make things a little less contrasty. You might get a little, you know, sun sparks, sun shades, all that kind of stuff, to where generally one of the tricks for mirror lenses is to definitely add on, because these lack color and contrast, you definitely want a shade, something to put on to cover that lens. You want to make it as dark as possible in here so you don't have light bouncing around on the sides. And that is one of the reasons why I always will try to put something around the lens, or be careful how I'm shooting. That's just one tidbit. Once you get in there, you can also make it more contrasty in post-processing, but really you want to get it right in camera initially, right off the bat. Watch how the sun is to your side, how things are reflecting in there. Just look at your image, and if it looks a little washed out and you have sun coming from the sides, different angles, just get a better angle on it. Anyway, guys, if you've got questions, comments, concerns, put them down below, and I will see you guys next week.